The next portion in my lecture series for the principles of microeconomics. In this video, I'm going to take a look at demand, supply, and equilibrium. These are important because most people do not have a fundamental understanding of how a marketplace works. So the purpose of this video is to make sure that the students have a good understanding of demand, supply, and equilibrium. All right, markets have two components. There's a demand side and a supply side, and what we're going to do is go through each one individually, spend a little time on demand, spend a little time on supply, and then use them together in order to come up with what an equilibrium is. So the objectives, or what you should hope to gain from this, is you need to understand the components of demand analysis. So we're going to take a look at the demand side first. Most importantly, is this right here. For students to understand the difference between the change in demand versus a change in quantity demanded. This is important because students oftentimes get these two confused. They are not the same thing. So make sure you understand that if I'm talking about a change in demand versus a change in quantity demanded, they are not the same thing. They are two completely different items. And like I said, this is something that students oftentimes get confused about. We will take a look at what is a demand schedule, what is a demand curve, and what is the law of demand. So these are all important things to understand. And then we will take a look at determinants of demand. These are items outside of price that influence the demand for a particular product. In particular, we're going to take a look at a few items, including income, the price of related goods, people's tastes and preferences, and people's expectations about the future. What you expect to occur in the future has an impact on your demand today. Once we finish that, we will move over to the supply side and take a look at supply analysis. Now, the thing I will point out to you is that if you have a good understanding of the demand side of this analysis, then it'll be very easy for you to understand the supply side. So here we are going to take a look at change in supply versus change in quantity supply. Again, something that students oftentimes get confused about and think that these are the same thing. They are not the same thing. Just like when we talked about change in demand versus change in quantity demand and not being the same thing. The same holds for supply. We will then take a look at the supply schedule, supply curve, and the law of supply. All right, and then we will take a look at determinants of supply, things that outside of price impact supply. Once we have a firm grasp of this demand and supply side of this, we will use demand and supply together to understand a market equilibrium. So we use supply and demand together to show and illustrate what an economist means by an equilibrium. And then we will illustrate when the equilibrium does not occur, we will illustrate what economists mean by a shortage versus a surplus. So we will understand an equilibrium, and then if we have a situation where the market is not in equilibrium, and from that hopefully understand the forces that are built into the marketplace that will move us towards an equilibrium. Alright, so now we're going to take a look at the demand side, and I'm going to pull up some data points I have here. This data that we see right here, alright, on the x-axis we have quantity, and on the y-axis we have price. So the data that we see here, this data for price and quantity, is the demand schedule. So you can think of the demand schedule as price-quantity combinations listing out at different prices what people wish to purchase. So for example, if we take a look at the data I have here, you can see that at a price of 8, people don't want to buy anything. The price is too high. If we go to a price of 7, people want to buy 1 unit. At a price of 6, People want to buy 2. At a price of 5, people want to buy 3, and so on. So these are the combinations that show us price and quantity demanded. So if we take that data that's in the demand schedule, this data right here, and we graph it, and let me actually bring those points up first so they can actually be seen, and then go back to here. Those are the data points that we have from the demand schedule. So if we take the data that's in the demand schedule and plot it out and make a graph, we get our demand curve. And let me actually change that to a solid line. Sorry about that. Sometimes I don't don't have the functionality of this completely down. For users who don't know, this is something called OmniGraph Sketcher. It used to be for sale from the Omni Group. They stopped selling it, I believe, a couple of months ago, so you might actually be able to get this for free. I find it to be a useful little tool for doing graphs, particularly for economics. Unfortunately, I don't think the sales were that spectacular for this item. So they might be making this available as an open source program. So you might want to consider seeing if you can get a free copy of this. All right, so we've plotted out the data that was in our demand schedule, and we have our demand curve. The thing that you should notice about the demand curve, number one, it is downward sloping. All right, that gives us the law of demand. The law of demand states that there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity. So whatever direction price moves, quantity moves in the opposite direction. So the law of demand states that if price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. All right, if price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. So I mean, to illustrate this, let's just say we are at a price of 6. Our quantity demanded will equal 2. So at a price of 6, if we go to the table, it will show us that the quantity demanded is equal to 2. If we lower the price to 4, or actually let me lower it to 2, go to demand curve and straight down, that gives us a quantity demanded of 6. So what do we end up saying from this? That when the price fell from 6 to 2, and let me draw a little arrow in, maybe that will be helpful. So when we see the price fall from 6 to 2, we see that the quantity demanded increases from 2 to 6. So that is what I mean by the law of demand, that whatever direction price moves, quantity moves in the opposite direction. So make sure you understand that the relationship between price and quantity demanded is an inverse relationship. They move in opposite directions. Let me get rid of some of those items there. Sorry about the delay here. So here is our demand curve. So that, what I just did there, when I moved from this point, 6 and 2, so I moved from that point to that point. So when I moved from that price quantity combination, a price of 6 and a quantity demanded of 2, to a price of 2 and a quantity demanded of 6, I move from that point on the demand curve to this point on the demand curve. That is what is meant by a change in quantity demanded. When you have a change in quantity demanded, you're just moving to a different location on the existing demand curve. So if I move from one point, let's say here, to another point there, quantity demanded changed from 1 to 5. So make sure you remember that when I talk about a change in quantity demanded, I'm talking about changing my location on a previously existing demand curve. All right, so if you move from at one point on a demand curve to another, any number of points here, if I move from here to there, that is a change in the quantity demanded. We're saying that the price changes and that's causing the quantity demanded to change. A change in demand, on the other hand, is when the demand curve shifts its location. We end up with a brand new demand curve. So let me draw in another demand curve and show that to you. So let me draw a demand curve that goes from here to there. And this is, let's call it D0 for the original demand curve. And let's refer to this as D1, which is our new demand curve. Let me rotate them around there. All right. This movement from D0 to D1, let me draw an arrow in just to, or a couple of arrows to give that to you. When the demand curve moves from D1, from D0 to D1, that is a change in demand. When the demand curve physically changes its location, when we move from demand curve 0 to demand curve 1, that is a change in demand. So make sure you understand the difference between those two. A change in demand means that the demand curve physically changes its location. It either shifts to the right, it used to be D0 and it's now D1, or it could shift inward into this area in here. That is a change in demand. A change in demand means that the demand curve physically changes its location. It shifts upwards or it shifts downwards. A change in quantity demanded means that there is no new demand curve. We are on the same demand curve. So let me delete this out of here to illustrate that point. A change in quantity demanded means that we stay on the same exact demand curve. We do not have a new demand curve. And all we're doing is moving from one location on the demand curve to another location on the demand curve. So make sure you understand the difference between those two. A change in quantity demanded means we have the same demand curve, the pre-existing demand curve that we had, and we're just moving from one point on that demand curve to another. If we have a change in demand, the demand curve physically changes its location. It shifts to the right or it shifts to the left. So let me draw in another demand curve. Here's another demand curve. We call that D1. So the act of having this being the operational demand curve and now this being the operational demand curve, that means that there's been a change in demand, that there's been an increase in demand. We could also have a decrease in demand. We could shift this demand curve inward. And let's call that D3. Or D2 probably would be the better one to make it instead of skipping over D2. So if we move from D0 to D1, that's an increase in demand. That means there's a change in demand. If we go from D0 to D2, that means there is a decrease in demand. That is a change in demand. So make sure you realize that if we have an original demand curve and the demand curve shifts to the right or shifts to the left, that's a change in demand. If we stay on the same pre-existing demand curve, D0 here, and we stay with that original demand curve and we just move from one point to another point on that pre-existing demand curve, that is a change in quantity demanded. So I'm going to also review the fact that when I talk about a change in demand, A change in demand is caused by a change in the determinants of demand. All right, so make sure you remember that if the determinants of demand change, that is going to cause the demand curve to shift to the right or shift to the left, or shift inwards or shift outwards, however you want to describe it. So there's our original demand curve. Make sure you remember some of these determinants. Let me make that a little bit smaller. 28 should be good. So some of the determinants of demand. I already discussed income. If income changes, the demand curve is going to shift. We're going to have a change in demand. The change in demand is going to be dependent upon what type of good I'm referencing. So for income, if I ask you about income, I should also give you information about whether or not we have a normal versus an inferior good. So if I make a statement or there's a question about a change in income, it should also tell you whether or not it's a normal versus an inferior good. A normal good is something where demand increases when income increases. All right? So when income goes up, demand goes up. So for example, if I said something to you along the lines that there was an increase in income for a normal good, what happens to the demand curve? If this is your original demand curve, your new demand curve should look something like that. So our new demand curve will have shifted outward. So if we have an increase in income for a normal good, the demand curve shifts. Oh, didn't do that too well, did I? Income. So if an increase in income for a normal good, the demand for that normal good increases. People want to purchase more of that particular product because their incomes have gone up. So if the prices remain the same, quantity demanded is going to increase because of the fact that income has gone up and it is a normal good. So when you think of a normal good, think of if there's a normal good, if there's an increase in income, demand is going to increase. That there is a positive relationship between income and demand. If income goes up, demand goes up. If income goes down, demand goes down. So income and demand are positively related for a normal good. An inferior good is the opposite of a normal good. An inferior good is a good where when income goes up, demand actually goes down. So income and demand are inversely related for an inferior good. So also an example would be if income goes down, demand actually goes down. There are certain items that as people's incomes go down, they purchase more of particular items. Let me give you an example of each one. For a normal good, think of, for example, restaurant meals generally are considered a normal good. As people's incomes go up, they have a tendency to go out and eat more. Same thing, if people's incomes go down, people get laid off, etc., we move into a recession, people have a tendency to go out and eat less. So that is considered a normal good. An inferior good, I will give you an example of this. If you think generally of, I will go back a long time with this one. There was a car that was introduced in the United States in the 1980s called the Yugo, and it was made in the former Republic of Yugoslavia. This was a very inexpensive automobile. I believe in the 1980s you could get one for roughly $4,000. Let me ask you this. If somebody saw their income double, do you think they would buy twice as many Yugos? No, they would buy other items. They'd probably substitute up and get a nicer car. Instead of paying buy two $4,000 cars, they might buy a decent $8,000 or $10,000 car. So realize that when I talk about income, you have to know if it's a normal versus an inferior good. And you have to know which way your demand curve is going to shift. So make sure, number one, that when you're reviewing this and you're going through the textbook and the questions, make sure you understand the impact of income, particularly as it relates to a normal or an inferior good. Another item of importance to demand is the price of related goods. Let me move that down a little bit. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. There we go. And if I talk about the price of a related good, I'm going to need to tell you whether or not they are complementary or substitute goods. Would help if I could spell a little better. So, not only does income impact demand, but the price of related goods. And you need to know if they are complementary or substitute goods. A complementary good is something that is used in unison with a particular item. I can give you a couple of different examples. For example, some people argue that peanut butter and jelly are considered complementary goods. When people buy peanut butter, they have a tendency to buy jelly. Not for everybody, but on the economy as a whole. Let me give you another example. If you buy a car, generally, unless it's an electric car, you're going to have to buy gasoline. So cars and gasoline are generally complementary goods. Cars and car insurance are complementary to one another. Cars and repair services are complementary goods. All right, so complementary goods are generally used together. All right, substitute goods, on the other hand, are goods that can replace one another, is the best way to think of that. All right, examples that I oftentimes give is Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Some people don't think they're substitutes, but I know that there's slight difference in their taste. But to me, they're both cola products. So, for example, if Pepsi Cola were to all of a sudden double their price for their soda, I would switch away and buy Coca-Cola instead. So, substitutes and complementary goods are sensitive to changes in prices of one another. For example, if car insurance rates went up dramatically or doubled in the state of New Jersey, that would cause the demand for cars to go down. Because the fact that if it costs that much more to buy insurance, the cost of owning a car has gone up because of the complementary good, the insurance that you're legally required to buy, has gone up, and the cost of ownership of that car has gone up. So realize that prices of complementary goods, that if a complementary good goes up in price, the demand for the other product will go down. So that the price of a complementary good is inversely related to the demand of another good. All right? For substitute goods, the exact opposite is the case. If the price of a substitute good goes up, that increases the demand for the other product. Let me give you an example for the substitutes. I forget when it was, sometime in the 90s, there was a dramatic frost and coffee in the coffee growing regions, and the amount of coffee grown in the world dramatically decreased. So there was something that happened in nature, there was a frost or something, that destroyed, let's say, 20% of the coffee crop. So coffee prices went up by, I forget how much it was, 40 to 50% higher in 1 year. So what do you think people's reaction to this was? Some people decided, well, I'm not drinking coffee, it's too expensive, and some people substituted away and bought tea instead. So let's take a look at this from that perspective. So the thing that we're talking about is there's coffee prices increased. And what we're concerned with is what happens when we increase the price of coffee. What is going to happen to the demand for tea, assuming that they are substitute goods for one another? So when coffee prices go up, the demand for tea goes up. So that would cause the demand for tea to shift to the right. So an increase in the price of coffee causes the demand for tea to increase. So because of the increase in the price of coffee, our demand curve shifts from D0 to D1. All right, so that is what I mean by the price of related goods, that the price of substitutes and complementary goods will impact the demand for the other product. So realize that the demand for a particular product relates to the price of the product, people's income levels, all right, but also the price of related goods. If the price of those related goods change, it's going to impact demand for that particular product. When the price of coffee goes up, the demand for tea changes. All right. If the price of gasoline goes up, that's going to impact the demand for cars, those complementary goods. So make sure you realize that these are other factors besides price and income that impact the demand for a particular product. Another item that is important to understand is that people's tastes and preferences impact demand. People's tastes and preferences change over time. So this is something else that impacts demand. People's tastes and preferences will change over time. All right, I can give you an example. So people are starting to try and eat healthier. So you see a lot of healthier products out there. I remember, the Atkins diet was a big deal. There's always some diet that's out there, a new diet that's supposed to work for people. But people's tastes and preferences change to healthier drinking. I can give you an example historically. People in the past used to drink a lot of beer. I know I talked about beer and pizza in the Production Possibilities Frontier section, so let's keep that theme alive. People drank a lot more beer in the past because water supplies weren't very sanitary. If you go back to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance in Europe, I believe people drank 300 to 400 liters of beer a year. Now, the country that drinks the most beer, I believe, is the Czech Republic. They drink about 120 liters per year. So people drank 3 times as much beer in the past, a long time ago, because oddly enough, beer was the healthy alternative to water, strange as it may seem. But that changed over time. All right, once we started getting drinking supplies that weren't foul, people drank less beer because their tastes and preferences changed. All right. In some regions of the world, people are drinking more beer. For example, China, one of the largest growing economies, their per capita beer consumption has increased over time, where they drank very little beer and now they drink a lot more beer. So the demand for beer has increased in China because tastes and preferences have changed there. So realize that people's tastes and preferences change over time. What is popular 10 years ago is not popular now. Musical styles that were, in vogue in the 1980s, heavy metal, hair bands, etc., that's not popular anymore. So people's tastes and preferences change over time. And finally, realize that your expectations change, especially what you think is going to happen in the future is going to change your demand today. Let me give you an example. During the housing market crisis and the banking crisis and everything else that went on in the late 2000s, 2007, 2008, 2009, a lot of people were fearful of losing their jobs. And I knew quite a few people who didn't take vacations, who didn't go out to eat as frequently, etc. Their demand for vacations and their demand for restaurant meals decreased dramatically because they were uncertain about whether or not they were going to lose their job. So people adjusted their demands today because they were uncertain about what was going to happen in the future. So realize that if you expect things to become worse, the economy to move into a recession, that's going to impact people's demand for goods and services today. Another way you could take a look at this too is I can give you an example from the 1990s where there was a luxury tax placed on certain items. For example, if you bought a car or a boat, if you bought an item, I forget the exact amount, but let's just say it was a car or a boat above $40,000, you had to pay a special luxury tax on that item. This tax did not come into effect for several months or a year in the future. So what do you think people did faced with the fact that there was going to be a luxury tax placed upon these items? The demand for boats and luxury automobiles, those things above $40,000, increased prior to the sales tax being put in place. Why? Because people wanted to avoid paying the sales tax, so they increased their demand for those products in the present time. So in order to avoid paying that sales tax, that luxury tax, the demand increased in the present time. So realize that what people expectations as to what's going to happen in the future impacts their demand today. Now we're switching over to the supply side of things. And similarly to what we did with demand, I have data here. This is our supply schedule. So if we map out prices and the quantities supplied with those prices, that gives us our supply schedule. So you could think of the supply schedule as the data behind the demand curve. So here is the data for our supply schedule. So this shows us that at a price of 8, people want to sell 8. At a price of 7, people want to sell 7. At a price of 6, people want to sell 6, etc., going all the way through this. So let me actually highlight these so you can see them. And if I go back and connect those points, we have here, so if we take the data from the supply schedule, that gives us our supply curve. So if you take the data in the supply schedule, graph it out, you get yourselves your supply curve. The thing you should realize about the supply curve is that it is upward sloping. There is a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. As price goes up, the quantity supplied increases. So that is the law of supply, that there's a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. Now, please note also that we need to distinguish between change in quantity supplied and change in supply. Same as with demand, a change in quantity supplied entails moving from one point on the demand curve to another. So here, let's say this is our original point here, where the price is equal to 4 and the quantity is equal to 4. Let me actually draw that in and let me make that a dotted line. So, and make so at a price of 4, quantity supplied is equal to 4. If I raise the price, let's say I raise the price to 7. The quantity supplied increases to 7. So if I move from this point to this point, so if I move from a price of 4, I get a quantity supplied of 4. If I move to price of 7, my quantity supplied is now equal to 7. All I've done is move from this point to that point. I've stayed on the pre-existing supply curve, but I've just moved to a different location along the supply curve. So it's similar to the notion of change in quantity demanded. You stay on the same supply curve for the change in quantity supplied. You're just moving to a different location. So if I move from any point on an existing supply curve to another point on an existing supply curve, that is a change in quantity supplied. So let me get rid of those. Change in supply means that the supply curve physically shifts its location. So here's our original supply curve, and let me make that supply curve 0 just for notational purposes. Let me draw in a couple of different supply curves. So here, let me make that a solid line. And let me draw in another supply curve. So this is supply curve 1, and this is S2. All right, so if this is our original supply curve, a change in supply would mean that this is our original supply curve. The supply curve is either shifted to the right because of a change in the determinants of supply, or it is shifted to the left because of the changes in the determinants of supply. Just like the determinants of demand, a change in them causes the demand curve to shift its location. The same thing is with supply. If there's a change in the determinants of supply, the supply curve physically changes its location. So moving from supply curve 0 to supply curve 1, or moving from supply curve 0 to supply curve 2, is a change in supply. A change in quantity supplied means that we just move from one point on an existing supply curve to another. So if I move to any of these points on this supply curve, that's a change in quantity supplied. If the supply curve physically shifts its location, if the supply curve shifts from here to there, or the supply curve shifts from here to there, that is a shift in supply, a change in supply. So make sure you understand the difference between those two. Now, what are some of the determinants of supply? The ones I'm mostly concerned with, as long as you remember anything that has to do with a cost of doing business. In particular, wages, cost of capital, taxes / regulation. And think of these as if any of these costs increase, the supply curve will shift to the left. So the easiest way to remember this is that if a determinant of supply increases, if we have an increase in the cost of doing business, the supply curve shifts to the left. All right? So any increase in the cost of doing business, that increase is inverse related to the supply curve. It will shift to the left. So for example, if our original supply curve is S0, if I were to increase the wages that this company has to pay its employers, the supply curve will shift to the left. If it costs it more money to buy more machinery, more capital, supply curve will shift to the left. If this company is forced to pay higher taxes or have an increased regulatory burden that increases the cost of doing business, the supply curve will shift to the left. If we see the opposite, if we see wages decreasing, all right, if there's a decrease in wages that this company pays, the supply curve will shift to the right. If the cost of the capital it has to buy, the machinery that it buys, if that decreases in cost, that will increase the supply curve. If there's a reduction in the taxes or in the regulations that it has to comply to, that will cause the supply curve to shift to the right. So make sure you remember that I think number one, make sure you remember what the determinants of demand and supply are. And two, how do they cause the demand or the supply curve to shift? Those are the important components that you have to remember. Now that we've done both supply and demand together, that we've done them individually, now we're going to use them together and illustrate what an equilibrium is in the marketplace. An equilibrium occurs where supply and demand intersect one another. So if we take a look at what we have here, the graph we have here, we have our supply curve, we have our demand curve, and where they intersect one another gives us our equilibrium price. In this example, numerically, we have that the equilibrium price is equal to 4 and the equilibrium quantity is also equal to 4. This price is oftentimes referred to as the market clearing price by an economist. The reason for this is at that price, the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. So if you take a look at this, at a price of 4, the quantity supplied is equal to 4, and the quantity demanded is equal to 4. So at that price, companies want to sell 4 units, and consumers want to buy 4 units. At that price, the market is cleared because the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are equal to one another. So make sure you remember that an equilibrium occurs where where the supply and the demand curves intersect one another. That gives us our equilibrium price and our equilibrium quantity. Let us assume that we do not see the equilibrium price in the marketplace. So let me get rid of that equilibrium price. I'll make that opaque so we can't see it. Let's assume that the equilibrium price is below, not the equilibrium price, but the price that we observe in the marketplace is below the equilibrium price. That's a better way to state that. So let's say that a price of $2 exists in this marketplace. What is going to occur in this market? So this is our price. A price of $2 exists. Well, to analyze this, let's just take a look at what the quantity supplied and quantity demanded is going to be. If we take a look at the price, if we move from the price and go across until, what do we hit first? The supply curve. Our quantity supplied is going to equal 2. If we go from the price that's observed in the marketplace all the way over until we hit the demand curve and go straight down, that gives us our quantity demanded. So when the price is below equilibrium, we can see that the quantity demanded is equal to 6 and the quantity supplied is equal to 2. So we have a shortage. When the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, we have a shortage. So in this market, when the price is equal to 2, we have a shortage. And in this instance, the shortage equals 4. So we have a shortage, and it equals 4. And let me actually just draw in a couple of arrows here to hopefully make this clear. So when the price is equal to 2, the quantity demanded is equal to 6, the quantity supplied is equal to 2. The quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied by 4, and we have a shortage of 4 units because of that. What do you think is going to happen in this marketplace when there's a shortage equal to 4? If you think of yourself as a company that's selling this, at a price of 2, you sell out quickly. You sell your product much faster than you thought. And after you sell out, people are standing there, they want to buy more of that product at that price. So most entrepreneurs would realize that I sold this out very quickly. I sold it out much faster than I anticipated selling this product for, and I had people standing around still inquiring about trying to buy this. So naturally, an entrepreneur at some point would think, well, why don't I raise the price? If I increase the price, that would eliminate this issue that I produced a little, people wanted to buy a lot more than that, let me increase the price. So I want you to understand that when you have a shortage, there's a natural tendency for the price to move upwards to eliminate that shortage. Okay? And what will happen is that price will migrate upwards until we get back to that equilibrium. So for example, what would happen if the price increased to 3? So let's move this up to here. So the entrepreneurs realized that at $2, they had excess demand is another way that you could refer to a shortage. So they raised the price in response to the fact that there's excess demand. So let's say they decide that they're going to sell this product for 3. This does decrease the shortage, right? When increasing the price up to 3 increases quantity supplied, because remember, as the price goes up, the individuals want to sell more. So as the price goes up, the suppliers of this product start supplying more of that because the price is higher. But what happens on the opposite side? On the demand side, the quantity demanded goes down. As the price goes up, fewer people want to purchase that, or also they want to purchase less of that particular product. So if we migrate up and we have a price of 3, we still have a shortage. We have a shortage of 2 units. The quantity supplied is now equal to 3, but the quantity demanded is now 5. So we still have a shortage of 2 units. So the suppliers of this product are still selling out the product faster than they thought, and they have people coming up to them after the fact, after they've sold out, inquiring about buying that product. So in the face of that, the price migrates up even further. Once we get to a price of 4, what happens? The shortage no longer exists because at that price, the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are both equal to 4. All right, so let me move that out there completely and bring this back up. So once we get to the price of 4, we see that shortage has been eliminated. That at the price of 4, companies are supplying 4 units and people want to buy 4 units. Let's suppose that for some reason the price is above the equilibrium price. So the equilibrium in this marketplace would be a price of 4 and a quantity of 4. Let's take a look at what happens if a price of 6 occurs in the marketplace. So if we go from that price of 6 straight across, the first thing we hit is demand. So if we go from the demand curve and straight down, that tells me the quantity demanded is equal to 2. And if I go from the price all the way across until I hit the supply curve and then I go straight down, I see that the quantity supplied is equal to 6. So now we have the opposite occurring. We have a surplus in the marketplace. We see that individual firms are supplying 6 units, but people only want to buy 2. So at the price of 6, companies are willing to sell 6, but at that price, people only want to buy 2 units. So this is referred to as a surplus. So let me put in surplus of 4. So we have a surplus of 4 in this marketplace. So we have the quantity supplied is equal to 6, and the quantity demanded is equal to 4. Let's get rid of those items. So what do you think is going to happen? Well, if you're a business person and you've got the price of an item you're trying at 6 and you can't sell it out, it's just lying around accumulating inventory, you're going to realize at some point that the price is too high. You're going to have to start cutting the price. So let's lower the price down to $5. At $5, what do we end up seeing? That the quantity demanded is now equal to 3, and the quantity supplied is now equal to 5. So the surplus has shrunk from 4 to 2, but we still have a surplus. These companies are producing things that people don't want to buy. So they're seeing their inventories accumulate. So again, what's going to occur? We're going to see the price migrate down. Let's say it migrates down to 4. What's going to occur? We're going to be moving towards an we've moved and we've reached the equilibrium. That the quantity supplied is equal to 4 at the price of 4, and the quantity demanded is also equal to 4. So at the price of 4, quantity supplied and quantity demanded are equal to one another. So the purpose of that exercise was to show you that if the equilibrium price does not exist in a marketplace, that there are forces in place that will have a tendency for the price to move. If we have a surplus where the price is above the equilibrium price, there's a tendency for the price to migrate downward until we reach the equilibrium price. If we have a price below equilibrium that is causing a shortage, prices will migrate upward to eliminate that shortage, and they will migrate upward until we get to the equilibrium price in the marketplace. Hopefully that all was of some help to you. I think this is a very important component. I stress this because I feel it's important for students to understand the basics of how a marketplace works. So just a quick review. Make sure you can understand what a demand schedule is and how that data in the demand schedule gives you a demand curve. With the law of demand, make sure you remember the law of demand means that there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity. Also, most importantly, make sure you can distinguish between a change in quantity demanded versus a change in demand. This is something students oftentimes get confused about. Also, realize the determinants of demand. So make sure you remember the determinants of demand, particularly income. And with income, you need to know if it's a normal versus an inferior good. Other determinants of demand are the price of complements and complementary goods and substitute goods, tastes and preferences and expectations. But make sure, besides remembering the determinants of demand, make sure you understand that when those determinants change, how does that change your demand curve? Or how does that change demand? The same thing needs to be said for supply. Make sure you understand what a supply schedule is and how that relates to your demand curve. Also, remember what the law of supply is. The law of supply is there's a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. Make sure you understand the distinction between a change in quantity supplied and a change in supply. And finally, for that component of it, make sure you understand what are the determinants of supply. Particularly if you think in your head globally, as the determinants of supply are the costs of doing business. Wages, the cost of capital, taxation, and regulation of a company all impact the supply curve of a company. Finally, we used we use supply and demand together to determine what an equilibrium is. So make sure you understand what economists mean by an equilibrium, and also realize that what is a shortage, what is a surplus in a marketplace, and how is it that in the market there are tendencies for the market to move back towards an equilibrium. If it goes into disequilibrium, be able to explain what forces come into play that move us back towards that equilibrium. Hopefully that was of some help. If you have any difficulty with this, make sure you can contact me. Again, I have my regularly posted office hours. You can always come and see me during then. You can ask me questions at break at class or after class, or you can make arrangements for a special appointment for office hours.